underestimate how much adversity Larry Bird faced.
There's a particular kind of sadness attached to watching Larry Bird approach 70, and it isn't the sadness people usually reach for when writing about aging athletes. This isn't about money problems or being forgotten or bitterness. It's something quieter and more human than that. It's the sadness of seeing what more than a decade of professional basketball actually cost one of the most singularly determined competitors the sport has ever seen. The Larry Bird most people carry in their memory is almost mythical. He played through injuries that would have shut down other careers. He willed teams to championships through pure competitive stubbornness. Across 13 seasons, he made the case over and over that a kid from a small town in rural Indiana with limited athletic gifts could outthink and outwork nearly everyone else on the floor. That version of Bird is permanent, preserved in box scores, highlight reels, and the memory of everyone who watched him. But the man living quietly in Indiana today is dealing with the physical bill that came due for everything those 13 seasons took out of his body. To understand how he ended up here, it helps to go back to the beginning. Larry Joe Bird was born December 7, 1956 in West Baden, Indiana, right outside the small town of French Lick. He was one of 6 kids growing up in a household under constant financial pressure, strain that eventually led his parents to divorce. His father, Joe Bird, took his own life when Larry was 18, a devastating loss for anyone, let alone a teenager still figuring out what direction his life would take. What he found in the middle of all that was basketball. Not as some calculated escape route out of poverty, that's often how these stories get told, but it's not quite accurate here. He gravitated toward it because he was simply exceptional at it, and being exceptional at something can anchor a young person when very little else in their life feels stable. He started college at Indiana University before transferring to Indiana State, where he grew into one of the most talked-about college players in the country. His junior year was genuinely special, and it carried Indiana State all the way to the 1979 NCAA championship game against Magic Johnson and Michigan State. Bird's team lost that game, but the matchup lit the fuse on a rivalry that would go on to reshape the entire NBA. Boston had already drafted Bird back in 1978 and simply waited an entire year for him to finish out his college eligibility. The patience paid off instantly. Bird arrived for the 1979-80 season, and the Celtics jumped from 29 wins the year before to 61 wins with him on the roster. That's not a coincidence. That's a player transforming a franchise overnight. What made Bird special wasn't just his scoring, even though he could score from virtually anywhere on the court with what looked like minimal effort. It was a level of basketball IQ that lifted everyone around him and left defenders second-guessing schemes they thought were airtight. He processed the game on a different plane: angles, spacing, timing, positioning. And while it looked instinctive, it was really the product of relentless, obsessive practice. As a passer, he made the ball show up in places defenders never saw coming. As a rebounder, he made up for average athleticism with precise positioning and timing, consistently outboarding players who were taller and faster, simply because he understood where the ball was headed before they did. And as a shooter, his form was as clean as it was nearly unguardable, because he could manufacture a shot from anywhere on the floor and had the confidence to take it no matter the situation or stakes. The bigger the moment, the more comfortable he seemed. He'd openly tell defenders what shot he was about to hit, then hit it anyway. It wasn't ego. It was simply that once he'd decided, there was rarely anything anyone could do about it. The resume backs up the legend. 3 straight MVP awards from 1984 through 1986. 3 championships, 1981, 1984, 1986. 2 finals MVPs. 12 All-Star selections, and a gold medal with the 1992 Dream Team. Over 897 regular season games, he averaged 24.3 points, 10 rebounds, and 6.3 assists a night. None of that stat line tells the real story on its own. Those are just the outline of 13 seasons in which Larry Bird stood among the 2 or 3 best basketball players alive.
Anyone who watched him knew the numbers were only a fraction of what he actually was on a basketball court. What the numbers can't show you is the price, the floor burns, the collisions with men bigger and longer who were actively trying to dismantle him physically under the boards. Playoff games played on ankles and knees that weren't really working. Shots launched off shoulders and hands that had taken a full season's worth of abuse. Bird wasn't just skilled, he was a physical competitor who used his body like a tool, running it until it broke down. And it eventually did, in ways that would shape the rest of his life. His back is the injury that defines everything. It wasn't one dramatic moment. It accumulated across years of jumping, twisting, landing, and competing at the highest possible intensity. By his later seasons, the pain had gotten so bad that he would lie flat on the floor next to Boston's bench mid-game just to relieve pressure on his spine enough to go back out and play. Sit with that image for a second. One of the greatest players who ever lived, stretched out on the hardwood next to his own teammates, not out of surrender or theatrics, but because that was literally the only way to manage pain severe enough to keep competing. He had bone spurs removed from both heels before the 1986-87 season, costing him real time. The back kept deteriorating. By his final season, 1991-92, it limited him to just 45 games, and yet he still made the All-Star team that year. Maybe the single most fitting detail of his entire career. Even broken down, he was still better than almost everyone else on the floor. But broken down is exactly what he was. On August 18, 1992, at just 35 years old, he announced his retirement after one last run with the original Dream Team that summer, playing through whatever his body would still allow. Retirement didn't mean stepping away from the sport entirely, and what came next proved his basketball mind never depended on his body cooperating. He took over as Indiana's head coach in 1997, at a time when nobody was sure a player of his stature could jump straight into coaching without paying assistant coach dues first. He won Coach of the Year in his very first season, which answered that question immediately, and coached the Pacers to the 2000 NBA Finals before stepping down, citing a preference for a quieter life over the grind of the job. He came back as team president in 2003, built competitive rosters in a brutal Eastern Conference, won Executive of the Year, retired from the role in 2012, returned again in 2013 when the franchise needed him, and finally stepped away from day-to-day work in 2017. Few former players have transitioned into front office success as thoroughly as he did. Not because he loved the spotlight of the executive chair, but because he simply understood basketball and made decisions that reflected it. And then, once again, he chose to walk away, not because the game had failed him, but because Bird has always had a sense of when it's time to exit.
Even while staying connected to the sport during those years, something about his relationship with public life kept shifting. He was never a celebrity in the modern sense to begin with. During his playing days, he gave interviews out of obligation, not enjoyment, said exactly what he thought, sometimes bluntly, and got back to work. He never built a media persona or chased endorsements beyond what came naturally with his stature. He wanted to win games, not be famous in the abstract. Once winning games was no longer on the table, the usual incentives for staying visible simply stopped mattering to him. These days, Bird lives quietly in Indiana, near the place he grew up, spending time with his wife, Dinah, golfing and fishing, a life almost impossible to square with the fierce competitor fans remember. No social media, no regular TV hits, no brand deals, no scheduled public appearances reminding the world who he used to be. No podcast, no documentary press tour, no 30-city memoir circuit. He's essentially skipped the celebrity maintenance routine most retired athletes feel pressure to keep up, and he's done it with the same bluntness that defined the rest of his public life. If you want to find Larry Bird, you're coming to Indiana. He isn't coming to you. The contrast is jarring when you hold both images side by side. There was a Larry Bird who walked into Boston Garden on playoff nights and changed the atmosphere of the building just by being there, who calmly buried shots defenders knew were coming and still couldn't stop, who trash-talked opponents mid-possession with a coldness that was almost scarier than his actual game. That man performed in front of tens of thousands live and millions on television, burned into the memory of an entire generation of basketball fans. Now, picture a quiet Indiana morning, a golf course, a fishing line dropped in still water. No cameras, no crowd, no opponent. That's the same man 4 decades later. The gap between those two pictures is exactly where the sadness in this story lives. People who've seen recent photos or footage of Bird have noticed how visibly he's aged, the way serious athletes tend to age, which is to say plainly, without any effort to disguise it. There's no polished, camera-ready version of him managing public perception. What you see is simply what 13 years of professional basketball, plus the decades since, have left behind. That gap between memory and reality is a big part of why this story resonates. It's not just ordinary aging, it's the specific kind that comes from using your body as a professional tool for over a decade, and then carrying the accumulated bill for the rest of your life. Bird hasn't hidden from any of it. He just lives with it, quietly, in Indiana, where nobody needs him to be anything other than what he currently is. And here's maybe the most striking detail of his current life. Bird has said publicly that he can no longer simply go for a jog. Not a marathon, not a hard workout, just an ordinary jog, something billions of people do without a second thought, is no longer something his body allows. Decades of professional basketball and the surgeries that followed have narrowed what's physically available to him in ways that are genuinely hard to reconcile with what that same body once did on basketball courts across the country. Think about what that means for someone whose entire identity was built on physical dominance. For most people, not being able to jog is a minor inconvenience. You take the elevator instead. For a man who spent 13 seasons outrunning, outjumping, and outworking the best players alive, who trained obsessively even during off-seasons most players use to rest, losing something as basic as a morning run is a different kind of loss entirely. It's a reminder that the body eventually collects on everything a career like his demanded, and nobody, no matter how great, gets an exemption. He stays active within whatever limits his body sets. Golf gives him competition and time outdoors. Fishing gives him solitude and patience. Neither is the behavior of a broken man, but the fact that he's had to adapt at all says something about the distance he's traveled from the Boston Garden hardwood. He was also diagnosed with atrial fibrillation back in 1995, adding another layer of health concern into his post-retirement years. He's reportedly told his wife, somewhat fatalistically, that tall men tend not to last as long as everyone else, and he said publicly he doesn't expect to see 75. He said it characteristically, without fear or self-pity. If it happens, it happens. That's roughly the posture he's taken towards his own mortality, and in some ways it's more unsettling than if he'd expressed any distress about it at all.
So, is the life Bird is living now actually sad? That deserves a real answer, not a simple one. From one angle, yes, there's something genuinely melancholy about watching a man who once symbolized what the human body could achieve through effort and will, now live with real physical limitations, almost entirely removed from public life. The contrast between the memory and the man is stark. From another angle, the picture flips entirely. Bird is financially secure. Reported net worth estimates put him somewhere around $75 million, built from his playing career, endorsements, coaching, executive work, and investments over the decades. He has a family. He has hobbies that give him genuine daily satisfaction. He has a level of privacy most people at his fame level never get to experience. He's reached a point where he doesn't need anything from the public, and he seems entirely at peace with that. being left alone might be his greatest luxury. The comparison to Magic Johnson is worth sitting with. These two men defined each other's careers. Their rivalry through the 1980s remains the standard every NBA rivalry since gets measured against. They entered the league the same year, faced off in the 1979 championship game, and spent a decade pushing each other to be better. But they've taken almost opposite paths since. Magic stayed highly visible, building business ventures and maintaining a massive cultural footprint well beyond basketball. Bird did the opposite. He stepped back, let the resume speak for itself, and never felt the need to remind anyone it existed. Neither approach is wrong, but at Bird's level of stardom, his retreat from the spotlight is unusual enough to make his current life feel genuinely different from what people might expect. In an age where former athletes are basically expected to run podcasts and stay constantly visible, Bird's silence stands out, and it's arguably its own final expression of the same self-assured competitiveness that defined how he played. He doesn't need anyone's attention. He never really did. For younger fans who mostly know him through highlight reels and stat lines, this quiet, private life can feel almost contradictory. The trash-talking, clutch-shooting figure from the archives is now an older man in Indiana who has no interest in being documented. For fans who watched him play live, his aging works more like a mirror than a biography. The star they watched as kids is closing in on 70. Time doesn't carve out exceptions for legends. What's left of Bird's public footprint now is essentially the archive, the highlights, the numbers, the stories told by teammates, opponents, and everyone who watched him, the trash talk aimed at defenders right before he buried impossible shots, the 1984 playoff run where he'd announce exactly what he was about to do and then do it anyway, the steal against Detroit in the 1978 Eastern Conference Finals, still one of the most replayed clips in NBA history, the championships, the MVPs, the Dream Team summer, a coaching career that started under skepticism and ended in recognition. That record is permanent, and it doesn't require him to show up on television to keep its weight. His return to Indiana reflects something that was always true about him. He wasn't just from Indiana. He was shaped by it in ways that influenced his relationship with fame more than his talent ever did. French Lick wasn't a place that produced people who performed their accomplishments for an audience. It was a place where what you did mattered far more than how you talked about it. That value stuck with him through every phase of his career. Having proven himself completely across 13 playing seasons and 2 separate roles in a front office, he clearly doesn't feel obligated to keep proving anything. The championships are real. He's earned the right to go fishing. Professional athletes spend their youth being rewarded for physical gifts in ways that are almost impossible to replicate in any other walk of life. Speed, strength, endurance become central to identity itself. For Bird, that shift is especially stark because his sense of self was built entirely around toughness and physical competition. Losing the ability to jog after 13 seasons as one of the most physically committed competitors the sport has ever produced isn't a minor thing. He didn't just lose athletic ability. His whole sense of who he was had been tied to what his body could withstand.
Zoom out and look at the whole arc. A poor kid from French Lick finds his identity in basketball, goes to Indiana State, loses the 1979 title game to Magic Johnson, arrives in Boston, and immediately transforms the franchise. He wins championships, wins MVPs, fuels a rivalry credited with saving the NBA's TV ratings, plays through pain that would have ended most careers, lies on the floor next to his own bench just to manage a collapsing back, plays in the Olympics at 35 while barely able to function at full strength, retires in 1992, coaches the Pacers to the finals, wins Coach of the Year, becomes an executive, wins Executive of the Year, walks away from the organization, and eventually retreats almost entirely into a private life in Indiana, fishing, golfing, and declining every opportunity to perform fame. That arc holds achievements most people can't imagine, and physical costs most people couldn't survive doing professionally. It holds a second career nearly as successful as the first, and a deliberate decision to eventually step away from it all and simply exist without basketball demanding something from him every day. Approaching 70 as December 2026 arrives, Larry Bird has nothing left to prove to anyone. His championships weren't revoked, his MVPs weren't taken back, his place in basketball history is as secure as anyone who's ever played the game. The sadness this story points to is real, but it belongs more to the viewer than to Bird himself. It's the sadness of time, of watching someone who once seemed unstoppable get revealed, through the ordinary process of aging, as human after all. That's not a tragedy, it's just true. And Bird seems to have made far more peace with that truth than most of us have made with simply admitting it exists. The world will keep remembering Larry Bird for the clutch shots, the trash talk, the rivalry with Magic, the championships, the almost unnatural will to win. But his life at nearly 70 is about something much quieter, accepting what his body can still do, protecting whatever privacy is left after a life lived entirely in public, and settling into fishing, golf, family, and the kind of ordinary peace that a career as extraordinary as his eventually earns the right to have. Let us know in the comments, does the life Bird is living now do justice to the legend?